It's July 2018, and Dr. Dawn Berry is working in her office. The Chief of Research for Korea at the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA, Dr. Berry has devoted a decade of her life to discovering and identifying the lost remains of fallen American soldiers. As part of her duties, the Canadian-born researcher has met with hundreds of families of the fallen and gets to know many of them almost like her own family. One lost soldier in particular always stayed in Dawn's thoughts.
Delbert. Okay, so Delbert Holiday is a special person to me.
Private Delbert Holiday was born in Minnesota and joined the Army at age 21 to fight in the Korean War. On November 30th, 1950, he was killed in action while his unit was engaged in combat, and his remains were buried and lost.
Often their families would give me pictures, and Delbert was one of the pictures that I had up on my desk. In his individual deceased personnel file, he's kind of leaning back and looks really cheeky. And at the bottom of his picture, it says, "To Unit, Love Delbert." So I had his picture beside my desk, and every day I'd come to work and I'd sing, "Holiday, Celebrate," and start working on all this analysis that we were doing.
Dr. Berry and her team suspected that Private Holiday's remains had been transported back to the United States in the late 50s. But insufficient technology had prevented them from doing any sort of proper identification.
One of the real challenges with Korean War remains is that when they disinterred them, they were covered in this formaldehyde powder. So they developed a separate process called chest radiograph matching. And we like to joke that there's no historical emergencies, but we got a call from St. Louis, the National Archives there, and they said, "Hey, we have all of these radiographs and all of the books that match them." And that served as the foundation for a new scientific identification process called chest radiograph matching, because everyone's clavicles are unique like a fingerprint. And the really cool thing about clavicles is we have people's tuberculosis intake papers. That was the radiograph. And so we can use points of concordance like we can with a fingerprint to be able to match the person with the clavicles that we have now.
And then, only hours after the analysis team had started their work, Dr. Berry's phone rings.
So the analyst who worked on it gave me a call and she said, "It's Delbert." So I grabbed Delbert's picture and I ran up the stairs to the lab crying, and I was singing, "Holiday, celebrate, holiday, celebrate, holiday, celebrate."
A priest from a small town out on those Kansas plains. To the soldiers who walked beside him, they would never forget his name.
And for me, it was sort of a palpable reminder of like why we get up in the morning, why we continue the work that we're doing. And what I often say is, there's nothing better that I can do with my life than help someone get their name back.
Dr. Dawn Berry is just one of countless individuals at the DPAA who have devoted their life to bringing people home and providing closure for families. In this second episode of our two-part special series on DPAA, we'll be speaking with Dr. Veronica Keyes, more with Dr. Dawn Berry, and then again with Ray Capon as they detail the process and the emotional aspects of bringing Father Emil Capon back home.
In my citizenship interview, they asked me why I wanted citizenship, and I talked about Daniel and Delbert and a couple of other service members, and that was the answer that I gave, because this is one of the only countries in the world who does this for its missing, and I think it's an amazing thing, and it makes me proud to be American. And I normally cry when I say that, so apologies if I get teary.
I'm Carrie Varuhaikis, and this is Army Matters.
Boys days I'm finally going home at last.
I had the good fortune, along with our show's executive producer, Nzinga Curry, of visiting DPAA's Honolulu lab last month. As soon as we entered, we felt calm, an emotion they want every family that visits to feel. From there, we were given a tour of the facilities, which included topographic maps, large tables with sets of remains that were being analyzed, and on this visit, a set of remains wrapped in a Korean flag that was about to be repatriated via the United Nations. Most striking were the posters of soldiers who had gone missing, almost like classmates. Many of them were obviously too young to enlist. In this first chapter, our hosts sit down with Dr. Veronica Keyes to discuss how the team was able to properly identify Father Emil Capon's remains and how she explains her job to her son.
My name is Dr. Veronica Keyes. I am a forensic anthropologist with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, and I am the project lead for the Korean War Identification Project at the laboratory in Honolulu.
Excellent. So tell us what DPAA is and what is it that you do?
Yeah, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency is it's a military agency, and we are charged with locating and identifying all unaccounted for service members from all previous U.S. conflicts. So our work spans from World War II through the Cold War. So we have a bunch of different wicked smart people doing a lot of different things, but we've got researchers and historians that do a lot of the work to try to find information about where service members might be located. And then in the laboratory, we have archaeologists and anthropologists and a lot of other scientists and support staff that then work on recovering those remains and then identifying them so that they can be returned to their families.
So when new remains are received, what's the process that you and your team use to properly identify them?
Currently, a lot of the remains that we're working on are coming in from the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu. The remains will come in. We have an area where we can clean them and inventory everything, kind of assess what we have to work with. And then depending on the set of remains, we will kind of make a plan of what types of testing we can do with those remains to try to identify them. So we usually have some information about where the remains were recovered from. We'll have, depending on what's present, we might have teeth or other skeletal elements that we can use to try to build what we call a biological profile. So we can look at these remains and determine how tall that person was, about how old they were, and then we try to identify things that would be noted in their military records, because for most of these individuals, we have their service records. So we'll have dental records for them. So we will cut small sections of the bone and we will send it to them, and they will do DNA testing to try to get a match to one of the service members' family members. So for a lot of these conflicts, DNA wasn't known about. So for our DNA testing, we use references from their family members. And then we can use that to kind of narrow down the list of individuals that we might be looking at for a match.
So we're going to talk to your coworker, Dr. Berry, about where Father Capon's remains were recovered. Now, what I want to know now is, once you actually disinterred them, how were you able to determine they were actually his?
Father Capon's remains were identified from a disinterment from the Punch Bowl Cemetery, the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. It's in Honolulu. And there were many remains that weren't identified after the Korean War, and they were buried there as unknowns. And over the last 20 or 25 years, DPAA has been in the process of disinterring those remains. Based on our research, we think we have an idea of who these remains might be. We will get permission to disinter them from that cemetery, and then we bring them into our laboratory and kind of go through that process I was talking about earlier. Father Capon's remains were disinterred in August of 2019. So they had been buried in that Punchbowl Cemetery since 1954, but at the time, no one knew who those remains belonged to. And then we did several types of testing, including DNA testing. So he had a family member who had provided a DNA sample. We were able to get, and he was the only match to those remains. So we had a pretty good lead right from the beginning. We also had dental records for him, and we were able to compare those dental records to the remains and had a possible match there. So there was nothing inconsistent about the remains and his records. We also had a chest radiograph. Our laboratory has developed a testing method where we take chest radiographs of service members from when they were inducted into the military. So a lot of them in the 50s, they were taking chest radiographs to screen for tuberculosis. And so we have these old X-ray films that we've digitized, and we can use those films to compare against X-rays that we take of the remains and then kind of do a comparison. And it's kind of like comparing fingerprints. No one's X-ray of their bones is going to look exactly like anyone else's. And we fortunately did have an X-ray for Father Capon, and we were able to do that comparison and get a match. And so this is usually how we build our cases for an ID, is we have multiple independent things that all are pointing towards one person. That's usually when we get to the point where we present it to our medical examiner to be identified. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, that case, we had a lot of information to work with. And fortunately, we had a lot of information about Father Capon to use. And so we were able to make that ID.
So he died in the POW camp, right? And then he was buried in Korea. So he was first repatriated from Korea to the Punchbowl in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. When did that occur?
The POW camp cemetery was in North Korea. It was near the border with China. And they had a local cemetery where they were burying POWs if they died in the camp. At the end of the Korean War, there was a turnover of remains. It's called Operation Glory. And a lot of individuals who had been killed in North Korea were turned over by the North Koreans to the U.S. The remains that were not able to be identified, those were transferred to Hawaii. That happened in 1954. So he was buried in the Punchbowl Cemetery in 1954.
Yeah, and just an important step, I thought, for our listeners.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Keyes, what lessons were you able to learn from your time at DPAA that you applied to Father Capon's case?
I think one of the most important lessons I've learned is that this mission is not only important to the people who are directly affected by it, I think it's important to the entire country. And we owe our society to these people who sacrificed everything for their country. And I think that making sure that we honor them and we don't forget them is part of our responsibility as Americans. The fact that the United States military makes this promise that they won't leave anyone behind, I think that DPAA is where we put our money where our mouth is. This is how we keep that promise. There are a lot of really smart, passionate people who are thinking about this every day, that they are not forgotten and that we are working to bring them home.
Yeah, that's good. And so one final question, what do your kids think about what you do?
I have a son, he's going to be 8 in a couple weeks. You know, I often travel for work. So tomorrow I'll be traveling for over a month for this next mission. And sometimes he doesn't really understand why I have to go or what I'm doing. I remember showing him the POW flag. There's the silhouette of a man in front of a tower of a POW camp. And I pointed to that flag and I said, do you see this guy on this flag? Mom's going to go look for that guy. And his family wants to know where he is and they're missing him and they want to know what happened to him. And Mom's going to go help try to find him. And so he So when he sees that flag today, he's like, Mom, that's the guy you're looking for. He's a kid. All he knows is that his mom isn't there. But I think he understands now that even though Mom isn't here, Mom's doing something that's important.
And Dr. Keyes, thanks again for being on the show. And thanks for being the wicked smart person that helps reunite service members with their families. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was nice talking to you all.
Do you have a lesson or insight to share? Would you like to strengthen the soldier profession? The Harding Project, a grassroots effort, provides resources to help you develop and write articles in Army journals that can help influence the next generation of soldiers. For more information, go to hardingproject.com.
Next, our host sat down with Dr. Dawn Berry, whom we heard from in the opening of this episode. She discusses how they were able to find Father Capon's remains and how her Canadian upbringing and knowledge of spring weather allowed for a breakthrough in the search.
I'm Dr. Dawn Alexandria Berry. I am the Korea Cold War Branch Chief for the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency.
Can you let us know, what do you do in your role at DPAA?
So right now, I am the Korea Cold War Branch Chief. So I oversee all of the Korean War research for the agency. So I have staff in Hawaii and I have staff in our DC office. And we do three main things. We help do the paperwork, and then we also go into the field for investigations. So we go and recover remains, and there are historians involved in that. So we write all the stuff for it. And then the second part, we work on the communication with families. So we travel around the country to our family member updates, and we sit down with families and tell them what we're doing for their cases. And then we also work on the last part of identification. So every identification packet has a historical report in it that says why a set of remains could be a person or could be a particular individual. And we give a historical analytical argument of why that is. And that goes into their ID packet.
Now, you have a number of degrees in various specialties, ranging from archaeology to anatomical history to military history, which all led you to where you are today. But can you tell us, how did your grandfather influence you in your current career?
A lot of that was shaped by my grandfather. So he escaped from a labor camp in Poland and joined the British 8th Army. He fought in North Africa and at Monte Cassino. And when I was quite young, I realized that First World War soldiers were not going to be at every Remembrance Day. My grandfather was not going to live forever. And I really wanted people to be able to remember why and how we have the world that we do today. So that's part of why I became a historian.
Now, we just finished speaking to your DPAA coworker, Dr. Veronica Keyes. Can you explain the difference between what you do and what she does?
I like to say that our work is a delicious historical club sandwich. So the work begins with history. We do the research to either have a disinterment happen or to go out into the field. And then there's some science that happens. And then often historians help with short lists in the laboratory. So historians are interacting with Dr. Keyes there. They're doing their forensic analysis. And then at the end, the last piece of bread is us writing the historical report. So we work with forensic anthropologists like Veronica quite a bit. But the lab pieces, the bacon and lettuce, I guess you would say, of the club sandwich would be Veronica. And we are the delicious toasted bread on the outside, middle, and end.
Tell us how you played a part and how you aided in that recovery and identification for Father Capon and why his remains were so important.
I had a Marine colonel boss. So I was doing all of this work on the Operation Glory Returns. And Father Capon had a very close connection to one of our former Marine colonels who was in charge of the Indo-Pacific Directorate. And so he would come to my desk every day and ask how research was going on North Korea. And he said, if there was one thing that we did, we have to identify Father Capon. And at the time, a lot of people had looked into it because he's very, very significant in the history of the war. And he's very significant for Camp 5. And he's very significant for people of the Catholic faith because he's a person of honor. And so I looked back through his documents and I talked to a few people, but he's believed to have passed away in the spring of 1951. And there was another story that they believed that his remains had washed away because we have a map that was written by a POW or drawn by a POW, and it has a little corner that says remains washed away. But as a good Canadian, we know that in springtime, you probably wouldn't go to the edge of a rushing river to bury a set of remains. So the argument that I made to leadership was that it's more likely that he would have been buried closer to where he passed. And because his name was on the Op Glory roster and of the timing he was buried, that it's very possible that he's in the Punch Bowl, if that makes sense.
How did it feel when you finally identified Father Capon's remains?
For me, the most emotional moment was when Colonel Gann called me when the identification happened. And he'll be mad at me for saying this, but he was teary. And I was teary that the identification took place because so many people went into making that happen. And it really was something that was very, very close to Colonel Gann's heart and helped drive a lot of the research that we did in Indo-Pacific Directorate.
Dr. Berry, recently our producers had the incredible opportunity to visit you at the DPAA. And they mentioned to me they noticed a bunch of rosettes on the wall. Can you let our listeners know what those are for and what they signify?
So when I first came to the agency at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, the Punch Bowl, every time an identification is made, they put a little rosette beside a service member. And when I first got here 10 years ago, there were very, very few rosettes in the Korea section. And when you go now, there are hundreds. And even just being a little part of putting some of those rosettes up, including Father Capon's, it's amazing to think of the people that they touched in their lifetime, but also knowing that you're part of something so much bigger than yourself, you know?
Dr. Don, thanks for all you do. And I did 30 years of the Army's deeds that need to be done. And I enjoyed it, so I didn't regret it. And I was an infantry soldier and fought in combat several times. And one of the reasons why American soldiers do what they do is because we know that if we get hurt, there's going to be someone there to take care of us, and they're going to do everything they can. And if we are killed, we know that we're going to come home. And there's going to be somebody there that's not going to quit until it happens. And that makes us fight hard. And it really does make a difference in the life of a soldier to know that even if the worst happens to you, you're going to come home. So thank you. Thank you. Thanks for being on the show today.
Did you know, as a member of AUSA, you have access to many benefits? From car rental to entertainment discounts, the opportunities are ample. Visit ausa.org/benefits to learn more.
In this final chapter, our hosts met up again with Ray Capon, the nephew of Father Capon, who describes the importance and the emotion involved with bringing his uncle home after more than 70 years.
My name is Raymond Emil Capon, and Father Emil Capon is my uncle.
Now, in the previous episode, you told us about Father Emil Capon and how great of a man he was. And then almost 70 years later, you received a phone call that the DPAA has discovered and identified his remains. Please walk us through that call
Yeah, it was, it still doesn't seem real, actually, because, all the POWs said he was buried in a mass grave because the ground was froze solid. Because, like I said, it was the coldest winter they ever had. And nobody had a clue as to where, or general location as to where. But we were at home. It was March 4th. It was 10 a.m. in the morning. We had phone rang, and I saw it. It said Fort Knox. And I was just like, geez, it's another scam call here or something. So I didn't even answer it. And my wife comes back and she's like, you better call this person. It's something about your uncle. And it was the Army. It was Michael Mee with the Army. And it was very short. It was like, well, I just wanted to inform you that we've identified your uncle's remains. And I literally dropped the phone. It was not even anything close to where I thought it could ever actually happen. And to actually hear that, if the Pope would have called and said we just declared him a saint, I'd have been less surprised in what this was. Like I said, to this day, I still wake up and think I'm going to wake up from a dream, and none of it was real.
So Ray, what would be one thing that you wish you could say to Father Capon?
Wow, I've never been asked that. I wouldn't have to ask him, were you happy or did you enjoy life? Because I know he did. Mm-hmm. Wow. I guess I would have to ask him, is it good to be home?
Yeah.
It's kind of like the song I did, the Home at Last song. That's where I kind of put myself. I think Father felt home with his boys in the camp.
Yeah.
I know he felt home, being out in Pilsen. It's where he grew up. But yeah, I'd have to ask him, are you happy being home? And where is home?
Is there anything that you want to tell our listeners about what you learned about yourself or what you learned about Father Capon? Because you've been through a lot. Your family's been through a lot.
For me, it's never give up hope.
Yeah.
It's easy in this time and how things are in this world to look on the bad things. My grandmother was always tell the stories, and she always, even though she had tears in her eyes because of losing her son, it was always, she always had that joyful side of things. And that's how Father was. No matter how bad things got, he always found something better to look at. He'd see the planes coming over, the U.S. planes flying over to camp. He's like, it's not going to be long, boys. It's not going to be long now, boys.
Now, Ray, you and your family spent 70 years of not knowing and the drama associated with all of this. What was the most emotional moment for you?
I can honestly say the most emotional moment was, and I'm not going to lose it here talking, but when we came out of the DPAA and his remains were wrapped in an Army blanket and they had the flag draped over it. And when we turned and came out of the DPAA, and there's that long walkway, and all the military were standing on one side and all the DPAA personnel were standing on the other side. And and all the military were in full salute, and all the staff at the DPAA had their hands over their hearts as we went by. And it just, every time I see that picture, it was like, and you could see how much they loved him, how much they put into identifying these people, and how much they know what it means and how much it means to be able to send a fallen soldier home. That moment will never, ever be forgotten.
And boys, I'm going home last. I smell supper cooking on the stove. Home at last. I see family and friends I love and know. When I get there, I'll say a prayer for you all, and you'll never be alone. Boys, I'm finally going home at last.
If you listen regularly to our show, you know that our hosts, Les and Dan, like to have fun. In today's chapter spotlight, we'd love to congratulate the Fort Leonard Wood Mid-Missouri chapter on a family event that would have been perfect for our hosts to attend. On April 24th of this year, the chapter put on its annual Mom See Palooza event to celebrate the month of the military child. The well-attended event, held for the second year in a row at Gerlach Field, included face painting, balloon artists, bouncy houses, axe throwing, and yes, donuts. Lots of donuts. The event was kicked off by Leonard Wood Command Sergeant Major Danny Castleberry and also incorporated a wide range of Earth Day celebrations. Over 70 Fort Leonard Wood organizations were involved, and the turnout was more than expected. Even everyone's favorite mascot, AUSA's Sergeant Hero, showed up to entertain the crowds and mug for the camera. Congrats to all the organizers of the event and to everyone who attended. If you or your chapter would like to be profiled on the show, please email us at podcast@ausa.org. Hooah!
To all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Army Matters is brought to you by the Association of the United States Army, the U.S. Army's professional association, member-supported, Army-connected. Visit us at ausa.org for more information or to become a member. Your membership helps AUSA continue to carry out its mission, educate, inform, and connect with the total Army, our industry partners, and supporters of a strong national defense. Today's episode was hosted by Lieutenant General Retired Les Smith and SMA Retired Dan Daly, and anchor hosted by Veronica Keyes. Anthony Dale Call is the producer and writer, and Andy Bosnack is the supervising sound editor. Ellen Toner is the content editor. Unzinga Curry is the executive producer, and the senior producers are Veronica Keyes and LaSharon Duncan. Be sure to subscribe to Army Matters wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave a review. As you know, we love seeing stars in the Army, especially if it comes in the form of a 5-star review. AUSA's Army Matters podcast can also be heard on Reach Across America Radio on Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern, on the iHeartRadio app, the Odyssey app, and the TuneIn app with the search of the word Wreath. AUSA's Army Matters podcast primary purpose is to entertain. The podcast does not constitute advice or services. While guests are invited to listen, listeners, please note that you're not being provided professional advice from the podcast or the guest. The views and opinions of our guests do not necessarily reflect the views of AUSA. For questions or to provide topic recommendations, email us at podcast@ausa.org. I'm LaSharon Duncan. Hope you have a great Army Day. Hooah!